Hello, welcome everybody to our webinar today on FDA discusses implications and opportunities of CSA draft guidance on 21 CFR Part 11. If you have any technical troubles, you can call 888-646-0014, or you can email us directly at info@connex.org. My name is John Kirchner. I am the production director of Connex. We're a leading educational partner. And we're happy to showcase this event. I think it's a hot topic continuing on our CSA conversation. In December, we had an event where Part 11 questions came up. There was a flurry of comments, and I know that this will be an interesting conversation as we address this issue. Other regulators across the globe are also looking at this issue, such as PICS and Annex 11. Next slide. For those of you who don't know, we are aligned with Temple University's RAQA graduate program. If you attend any of our events, you can gain 1.5 credit unit hours towards their graduate programs. So please check that out or email us with any questions on that program. Next slide. Just to point out, you can carry on this conversation at one of our events, namely Validation University coming up in March, where we'll be having a session on this as well as other CSA and computer validation conferences, and also validation just across the board, such as cleaning, process validation, equipment, facilities, and so on. We'll also specifically be addressing this issue in further detail at our May event, specifically on computer software assurance in 21 CFR Part 11. Next slide. We encourage you to become a member. You can have access to this webinar and all the other webinars we do during the year. There's 24 of them. We also house all of our SOPs, templates, master plans, sessions from our conferences in this portal. So please join this. It's really a great tool for you to advance your professional development. Slide. Without further ado, we want to get right down to it. I'm going to introduce my friend Khalid Musali. He is the Executive Vice President of Compliance Group. So Khalid, I'm going to let you take it away from here.
Awesome. Thank you, John. And thank you, Connex, for your partnership. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I know we started late this year. We usually start in January doing webinars around important topic, hot topic, CSA, CSV, Part 11, but hopefully we're going to get the ball rolling soon. Today, I definitely want to thank my panelists and thank you for making the time. I know how busy you folks are. Starting with the industry, I'm going to start introducing Joanne Goldberg, principal. Oops, let me share my screen here. Hopefully you can see my screen. Yes, can you see it?
Yep, it looks good.
Awesome, thank you. I want to introduce Joanne Goldberg, Senior Principal IT Business Analyst, Global IT. Trust me, she had a really long bio. I did not want to put it because I really want to save the time for us to talk about. So thank you, Joanne, for joining us. And then I switched to Cisco Vicente, the man behind the scene who really led the way to lean validation and supported the industry for the past goodness now 5 to 6 years until the release of the draft guidance CSA. By the way, that's his part-time job, just an FYI. He's got other jobs definitely within the FDA. Cisco, thank you for joining, appreciate it. And then our good friend Daniel Walter. Thank you, Daniel, for joining or coming to the dark side here to help us out, explaining and helping the industry eliminate confusions and concerns about certain regulations and help us understand about inspections, etc. So again, thank you for joining us. Daniel is a policy analyst at CDRH. So again, thank you all for joining. The topic today is, again, FDA and industry discusses the implication and opportunities. I really want to focus on opportunities. Implication kind of gives me the heebie-jeebie, but I'm going to focus really more on the opportunity, the CSA draft guidance on 21 CFR Part 11. With that, just want to do a couple of housekeeping. So I'm sure you're going to have tons of questions for the FDA mainly, and then the industry. Please type in your question in the question box, and then our friend Evan will work with us to facilitate, and we'll take those questions toward the end. Hopefully, we'll leave 10 to 15 minutes, and I try my best to do that, depending on the conversation, how it's going. But please ask all the questions you want. This is your opportunity to hear from the regulators. So today's topics is, and I think John mentioned it earlier, that we have quite a bit of questions about 21 CFR, about 11. Well, this guidance has been there, and now CSA, so how are we going to do this? Is quality of our computerized systems going to be impacted by that, right? Because the minute you mentioned the unscripted testing, and for those of you who's joining us for the first time, we're not going to go through 5 years back. Please review the draft guidance. But again, unscripted testing is becoming a question again. But anyway, we'll address that a little bit today. So we're going to talk about the confusion and concerns, regulators' expectation, right? That inspections continue to come to your sites. Why the fear, right? There is a fear out there. Should we be really fearing the FDA or collaborating with the FDA, right? Or should the FDA be afraid of the industry? Think of that. Is it CSA or 21 CFR Part 11 or both? What's going on in here? Is there a confusion going on here? Do they align, right? So I think our regulators here from the agency will help us. Since 1997 to 2023, 21 CFR Part 11 continue to be the same, right? I know there was some update back in 2003. What is going on in there? Is it time to change or about time? Then let's talk opportunity. And obviously the objective, we would like you to walk away with clear direction and understanding of CSA impact or effect on the 21 CFR Part 11. Alrighty, with that said, moving forward here, I just want to set set the stage here. And for those of you who are not aware, yes, the draft guidance has been released. There are a few items here that I'm highlighting, right, to avoid additional questions, just because we've answered those questions numerous times and we're going to focus on something different and new. So yes, this draft guidance will eventually, when it's finalized, it will replace Section 6 and the GPSV. Okay. Other ones, this guidance is not intended to provide complete description of all software validation. Okay, that is in the GPSV and also in 21 CFR 820 from a regulation perspective. This guidance is definitely out of scope for software as a medical device and software in a medical device. And then finally, this guidance has been prepared by CDRH, right, and the center and CBER, and consulted by CDER and OCP and ORA. So the question will come up later, right? This is the answer to it. Is it just CDRH? Is it just medical device, or the entire industry, right? So hopefully this little box number 5 will answer that question for you. Moving on, here we go. So confusions and concerns, right? Despite the FDA effort to provide clear, consistent approach to Part 11, compliance, manufacturers continue to express significant concerns regarding the regulations, right? So poor guys, the agency have been really providing a lot of guidance, a lot of information, yet it seems there's always that concern and confusion. So hopefully we're going to clarify some of that today. I'm going to start with the FDA, right? And Joanne, from an industry practitioner and a subject matter expert and a FICSA team member, I would like you to also join. But we're going to kick it off with Cisco. What type of clarification can we offer so we can ease manufacturer confusion and concern? And just briefly, if you can highlight that, pass it on to Daniel and then to Joanne.
You're asking for a brief highlight for something that I think has driven a lot of complexity in the way people think. I think one of the things that is important to note, when you look at what was done in the guidance that came out after the Part 11 piece, right? The agency clearly stated that, we were going to put the validation requirements that were in that original regulation and rule around Part 11 under enforcement discretion, right? Because they realized that a lot of this already falls under the bucket of what's in the validation requirements of the, the predicate regulations, right? The rules are already established before that. So they weren't looking to add anything new or new additional burden. The other thing is, and I get where part of the confusion comes from, and that may be a point of discussion later. The systems are a lot more integrated and tied together now than they were before. So the idea of discerning what is that Part 11 record, it gets a bit more clouded. So I know one thing to have people really back and look at is, what is required on the Part 11 record, right? What is it that's maintained? It's a lot smaller, I think, than people assume it to be. And just because the system is collecting data that might then create a record or be formed into a record for the agency or something that the Part 11 piece applies to, doesn't mean that that is also a system that is under the Part 11 validation requirements. But I mean, we can go into how to best approach that a bit later. But I think the idea is to keep in mind that the focus was, this isn't supposed to add any additional burden than what you already need to do. And secondly, the records that are required and the processes that are required are a lot more limited than I think people have been taking them to be.
Go even a step further than that, we talk about, and I think it's going to be an overarching thing that we talk about today, and that's the application of risk benefit, risk management to your systems as you look at applying Part 11 moving forward. We acknowledge the regulation is actually not Part 11 that says that you have to apply quality or things to your software. It's 82070 in our case, to make sure that your software systems are your non-design, non-system, their business process systems are in some state of appropriate validated control. So it's about applying the tenets to Part 11 to that, but that's also bounded by the ability to do that in a risk under a risk framework and apply appropriately, which is the entire purpose of the draft guidance, is to identify that yes, you do have the flexibility to apply that risk framework, and you do have the ability to make a judgment call as to what will have more of a bit risk, either for the product, business, to you, and to justify that, and then move forward appropriately with the a standing that then you can turn around and easily turn to say, hey, this was our decision making, this was our process, this is how we came to what we came to.
Joanne?
Yeah, those 2 points of clarification I think are important for manufacturers to understand. Cisco's first, that we are, as manufacturers, interpreting way more applicability to Part 11 than needs to, and going back and figuring out exactly what part of the system records are in scope is an effort that's worth doing. It takes time, but it is absolutely worth doing. And to Daniel's point, taking that risk-based approach and documenting it, it's that time up front, but it does clarify the scope of what we're doing and why we're doing it. And that is effort worth spending.
Great. Thank you all. This is great. This is all great, and you're making it really simple, at least for me here. It's clear. However, again, the agency intends to exercise enforcement discretion regarding Part 11 requirements for validation of computerized systems used to create, modify, maintain, transmit records. Now, could CSA lean validation? And again, starting 2023, I'm going to call it lean validation, right? We're switching a little bit here. cause manufacturers to be cited for not following regulations? And this question seems to be coming up a lot, right? And I know, Cisco, you've answered that in the past, but I really want you to focus the response on from a 21 CFR Part 11, right? The requirements. I'm hearing myself talking here. It's okay. 21 CFR Part 11 requirement is, is the issue here. Do I need to test everything? Do I need to script test everything? So again, we'll go with the roundabout with Cisco, Daniel, and Joanne.
Yeah, so let's start even with that concept of lean validation, right? The intent for this, and I think it's always been an agency intent, is that you should be using and optimizing your validation activities, right? They should be lean, they should be value added. What we tried to do here is make sure that it was clear. Here's an approach that you could use to say how you got through that and what kind of things you need to be able to explain, right? The risk, the decision making that went behind that, why that testing was sufficient. What was the end result? When we talk about that from a Part 11 standpoint, one of the things that we're not intending to do here is to say, this is the only approach you must do. And I want people always to remember, it's guidance, it's not regulation, right? The regulation has its baseline. It requires you to look at certain things, and then guidance does provide, agency thinking or clarification, or in this case, an approach that meets those requirements. So when you're thinking about that application to the Part 11 piece, right, one of the things that goes all the way back to identifying that intended use is think through early on, and I think Joanne mentioned beforehand, but thinking early ahead of time, is anything that you are using that system for going to be potentially a Part 11 record? And if so, just make sure, you can create it, you can modify, you've got the controls around it. That's just stuff that is part and parcel of, I think, a good validation activity. It doesn't matter if it is leveraging ad hoc testing that's using other experiential testing or other unscripted testing methodologies, or if you're using a script because that's easier for you as an organization. All that matters is that you thought about that requirement and you found out a way to make sure that that requirement was fulfilled. And it should be very straightforward.
Thank you, Cisco. Daniel, I just want to remind you of the conversation you and I and Joanne had, right? Digital transformation, technology has changed. So I just want to place that little bug in your ear here.
That's right. I think that it's important to remember, and you put up on one of the intro slides, that Part 11 was written in 1997. So let's think about computer systems from 1997. There were no apps, there were no phones, there was no digital connectivity. It was usually limited. There would be servers, but it was limited in scope. A lot of it was done on older systems and could easily be end arounded or hacked. And the point of this was to not require signatures. It was to, in concept, protect data integrity. It was an attempt to make sure that when the agency was looking for data regarding whether it is a pharmaceutical or a device or how it was manufactured, whatnot, that data was maintained in a structure and a state that could be appropriately assessed, not by the agency, but by the company, by the people who owned it, so that they could make common sense decisions on whether or not to take further action. Yeah, that was 1997. I think every single person in this room, even some of you weren't even born in 1997. It may actually have been to look at the things here and say, look, things have really radically evolved. Now, going to the question here, what's the fear of citation? The citation that's coming around is, do you have enough are you being cited for not following the regulations? Well, how would you not follow? Think about it in a classical bring me a rock sense. I think that's what most people are afraid of. You have an investigator in front of you saying, show me your proof, and that whatever you bring isn't going to be good enough. Like, here's my rock. That's not the right rock. Oh, okay. That's fair, except that the guidance that's laid out here, plus the regulations to some degree, do give you the boundaries about what the size of the rock, the color of the rock, and the things that it should be. It is a purpose to say have a ability to put your rocks in certain places so that you can go to a place and find the exact rock. or at least a rock that you believe is the best for the fit. And now, let's say the investigator is not confused about it. They should be able to ask you questions, not about the rock. If they do, then it's not about part 11. It's not about the system. It's about that drill down. If it's more about your rock selecting characteristics, again, is that part 11? That's more about your risk-based approach. So putting the risk basis up at the front and making sure that's solid, not only is that good for this application, it's good for all applications that you're running. That's going to be something that applies not just for computer software, it's going to apply for incoming acceptance, it's going to apply for quality assurance, it's going to apply for everything. Even design considerations, marketing considerations, all of them are going to apply. So being able to fall back on a solid risk-based foundation, risk management foundation, being able to look forward and say, if we can explain these things, then our problem isn't here. And so part 11 is, again, it's mostly just it's a boundary condition, not a gotcha condition.
Awesome. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Daniel. Joanne?
Yeah, so for me, I think that traditionally manufacturers tested and provided test evidence or attested to the fact that the regulation had been met with their systems. I think what the lean validation, what the guidance helps us with is, in addition to that, it gives us the opportunity to point to other activities that were done. What did the vendor of the software do? What do we know? It doesn't change the fact that the systems must meet those requirements, but the proof doesn't just have to be our own test evidence. And the regulation never said we had to do all of our own testing, but it is the habit that many of us were in. So I think that it's not that CSA is going to cause us to be cited. I think it gives us that opportunity to explain more fully what else we're doing.
Awesome. Thank you. And this really leads us to fear, because it's all about fear, right? So it's not CSA is going to cause you to be cited. With all due respect, it could be our ignorance as industry practitioners doing the wrong things, doing the wrong controls in place. So thank you. I thought that was clear from regulators and industry. So I appreciate it. So again, we come to fear here, right? Why manufacturers fear a document like draft guidance that actually gives us a lot of freedom? And I know Daniel and Joanne, we had that discussion yesterday, but of course I'm gonna ask Mr. Vicente here to chime in. And of course, the second question, is it easier for a manufacturer to just script the hell out of everything and call it a day, right? So again, it's a conversational piece here. I'd like you guys to provide your input. So Cisco.
So why do manufacturers fear the document? I think it's because of that aspect, right? It gives you a lot of freedom, and what they're fearing, we see this question a lot. They fear that something is going to go wrong, or they're going to do something wrong. But end of the day, what the document is stating and the practices that are involved there oftentimes give the manufacturer a lot more confidence that the system's working. So the fear is, are they going to do something that, they're going to get dinged on by the regulator, right? That's, I think, the big driving aspect of things. And when you give a lot of freedom, I think there is this perception that now there's places for them to hang themselves, when in reality, what we're saying is, really the opposite. There's a lot that you're already doing. The freedom here isn't in, the ability to hang yourself. It's in saying, here's all the things I do or have already done that give me this level of confidence that this system will meet the intended use. Therefore, this is all I need to do extra, because it's the piece that I still have, some risk about or some extra uncertainty about. So that's the intent, right? The idea here is not giving you freedom to hang yourself. And I think that's where the fear is coming from. It's giving you freedom to better articulate how you got to the decision you got to.
Thank you, Cisco. Daniel.
Oh, is it easier for a manufacturer to script Part 11? Is that part of the question too, or are we just talking the first one?
I think this is really a given one answer, but go ahead.
I was gonna say, it's easier depending on how you're doing it, what you're doing, and what you mean with the scripting. I leave that entirely up to you. Again, back to the freedom phase. What's the best approach and going to give you the best results in the fastest, most valuable time frame? But if you're doing it because it's just about generating documents, maybe look at that again and see if that's really bringing you the value you need.
Don't do it. Don't do it. Okay. Thank you, Cisco. Daniel, your input, please.
Sure. Manufacturers fearing the document. It's been my experience on both sides of the fence that industry wants regulations that are so clear, so defined, so well written as to leave no ambiguity or debate. And while on the one hand that makes some jobs easier, it also, in my experience on both sides, writes industry into very nasty corners. It makes things almost legally unescapable, especially if something goes wrong, especially if times change. I mean, Part 11, if a Part 11 was exact and specific, can you imagine the hassles and the outcomes? That's why they had to come up and say, oh, look, we got to move to enforcement discretion. Because it was moving so fast, they hit the gas right around 97. And then things just got out of hand. And look where we are. Nobody would have ever written Part 11 the way it's written today under the circumstances that we're in now. So we're trying to explain, hey, this is how we currently think. That's the purpose of a guide, currently think. And we're trying to give people the ability to say, look, by the time we actually write anything and get it through and approved, and we're the government, we recognize our own ability here. It takes a lot. And then to come out and say, by the time we actually come into and define on something specific, that's changed everything. And now there's a whole new universe behind where we're starting at. It's more appropriate to sit back, think about it, and put highly flexible but conceptual high principle guidelines around what the goal is. And I mentioned in my very first thing, it was about data integrity. That's what we're trying to protect. In addition to everything else, helping the business being able to defend itself. Is it easier? And I'm going to go this, and Joanne and I, we spoke about this a little bit. Is it easier for a manufacturer to script test? Sure. It's usually easier for a director who doesn't want to make a decision to go, you know what? I'm just going to script test it all. And that's fine. That's absolutely a decision. It's easier for them. It may not be easier on the budget. It may not be easier on the staff, but it's easier for them. So it really is who's making the decision about what that case is. And from a pure business case, having the freedom and flexibility to cut down and do a little bit upfront work and let that play out in the long term, it's been shown time and time again that saves more money and more effort and more energy and actually has dividends. So, I mean, how you could answer it, is it easier? It depends on who's making the decision. I'm sure that the line grunt that's the just newly hired test engineer that comes in on the system is going to be script testing every single password combination, isn't going to think it's the easiest decision in the world. So really does depend on how you approach the decision, but there are reasons, just macro business reasons, to be made for why it's a good idea to consider CSA.
Awesome. And I'm just going to add to my list of words here. We usually use the word critical thinking. I like the new one you use, currently thinking. This is beautiful. Thank you, sir. Joanne.
Yeah, so for me, I think the fear comes from the uncertainty. If there's the flexibility to analyze the situation, look at risks, look at what the system is supposed to do, that means that you have to have expertise. And if you take a consistent approach across the board and you always do the same thing, there's less risk that someone will ask questions, why is this different? But if you have the experience, if you have the knowledge to look at the situation and you do the activities that make sense to reduce the risk to ensure the compliance of the system, you can save a tremendous amount of time. So again, it's easier because you don't have to keep making decisions. But is it easier to maintain those scripts? Is it easier to execute those scripts? What ends up happening is we slow down the changes on our systems. We choose not to make changes that would benefit our organization, would benefit our processes, but we know that it takes time to test them, and so we're weighing those changes and the testing against the benefits of rolling out system changes. So that definitely uncertainty causes fear, and the historical response has been, we're just going to test everything because then we have the consistency, and anyone who comes in the door and asks us what we did, we just show them the test results. If we can document the risks and the approach we took, we can stand behind less testing, but it does take people to think about it and to explain it.
Totally agree. Thank you.
Yeah,
Go
just
ahead.
quickly add on to something there that Joanne said, because I think she hit something I think that people need to factor in, right? When she was talking about that risk piece, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like a lot of that risk people are worried about is that risk of not compliance, right? Because in time and time again, we've seen, even through the approach here, that oftentimes it's not really a safety concern, it's not a quality risk. On the contrary, we've seen actually people applying this when they start really thinking about it, get to some of those issues faster and better. But like you mentioned, it gives them a consistency, a defendable consistency, which to me speaks to that compliance piece. And then, like you said, slows down the ability to changes, which then does introduce that safety or security or product risk.
Oh, I'll even add on to that. So if the decision to test script test everything, or just to go all in and test everything, there's an assumption on that too. And that assumption is that you're testing it right. If you screw up that testing, then your whole, I put all my eggs in the total script testing basket, but you did it incorrectly. Now all of a sudden you're left with giant holes in the basket, and you're going to get picked apart for that, which goes to Joanne's point about having expertise, which is absolutely vital. You definitely need it, but it also goes to the point of planning. It goes to that upfront preparation stage to say, what do we actually do? And you would do that whether you're script testing or not. Hopefully, you're not just going to throw spaghetti at the wall with this if you're afraid that you're going to get in trouble for doing it wrong. One would hope that you're thinking about that, critical or current or whatever thinking. So if you're going to do that, then let's just add this concept into that thought process right up at the front. Hey, but do we have to do everything? And now you have the ability to say, maybe I don't need to have this particular aspect of it done, but that's fine. You can justify that, and it should be pretty straightforward. Again, you are trying to hone down to what makes the biggest difference here. But yeah, the whole idea of fear is coming from that uncertainty, and it's coming from the idea that you don't know what you're aiming for. Well, if you think about it a lot, many of the requirements pretty straightforward. They're not hiding from you, and they're not diving away.
Awesome. So really to summarize here, I mean, the agency is telling you basically, don't be afraid, do your job, critically think, right? It's not the document that we should be afraid of. So thank you for that. What I want to take us here a little bit, because that question also came up in various parts, right? So yeah, we've been, focusing on the Part 11 scope and application, and tells us how to validate. And we had all of our effort. We understand GPSV, we understand the regulation 21 CFR 20, etc. And now we have this. So all the validation that we've been doing, this is all about much to do with nothing. I mean, well, what's your thought on here? I mean, are you getting confused? Do we go right? Do we go left? Is it CSA? Is it Part 11? What do I do? I'm an industry practitioner and I don't know what to do. Help me, FDA.
So I'm going to say it's a little bit more of a loaded question with the idea as much to do about nothing, because to me, it seemed like that was always the case with all of this, right? Even with the idea of CSA to begin with, is this really much to do about nothing? But, you know, the reality of the matter is fear is still there, right? The misunderstanding, the lack of clarity is still there. So, you know, I can't explicitly state that it's much to do about nothing. I think it has to do with the fact that we haven't been explicitly clear about that and kind of left everybody hanging in to figure it out by themselves, and it's gone in all these different directions. I don't really think there is a split, right, between Part 11, CSA, as people say, one direction or the other. Daniel mentioned it beforehand, Joanne mentioned it beforehand. All it is, it's about critically thinking your requirements and then figuring out what the best strategy is going to be for testing that in a way that adds value to the organization. That's the biggest piece of all of this to keep thinking. And in that vein, CSA provides, again, just a framework. Not only a framework for that, but I think the big piece that people all keep worrying about, that fear portion, right? It provides a framework on how you explain that thought process to anybody, regulator, auditor, anybody else who comes in, right? Starting with the intended use, with that risk discussion. Daniel mentioned it ahead of time. That applies everywhere. It doesn't just apply here.
Awesome. Daniel, if you have, by the way, just to, I know I usually leave 15 minutes for questions, but we're having tons of questions actually. And within the next 4 minutes, we're gonna stop that and answer all the questions, if you guys are okay with that, because I think there's a lot of valuable questions in there. So go ahead, Daniel, if you wanna provide your input. Thank you.
So I'm just going to quickly add into what Cisco is saying, that I would encourage those of you that are asking how big a deal this is it much ado about nothing and whatnot. I would encourage those that are familiar with regulatory intelligence, those who actually go and they dig and they look for things, find the number of Part 11 citations that have been public, number of warning letters with some form of Part 11 citation in it, and then ask yourself, how often does this really happen? Now, that's not to say it isn't important, and it's not to say that it isn't something that we would look at. And I'm not saying there aren't any. There are, but as a grand scheme of things, most of the time, at least within devices, our concerns are with things like CAPA systems. And within CAPA systems, it's mostly that you said that you were going to do something through an SOP and that you don't. So logic dictates, if that's where we're putting the majority of our citations and you're not doing what you said you would do, something in this case, if you had a plan, like to how to apply CSA with Part 11 to your system, and you had that plan and you followed through on it and you had objective evidence for it, suggests that that's how it would be done. And if you didn't, the citation would come from not doing what you'd say you'd do, not so much from the fact that it's there. The flexibility is there, and what we're trying to say, as we've said from the start, you may have to actually not do as much. So as long as you have the plan that shows how you do it. Side note, this fits along line with the CAPA project that our group has been working on for a while. And the idea very much mirrors is that you put all your eggs to say everything deserves a CAPA. Well, reasonable people would say not everything deserves a CAPA. And if you can do that, then everything may not require full script testing. It's the same principle. You just have to find your way to explaining why you're not.
Awesome. Thank you. Joanne, your input in a minute.
Absolutely. So one little point we haven't talked about, and I think the enforcement discretion gives us an indication with CSA. If we start out, again, explaining what we're using, if we think about this regulation asking for integrity and authenticity of records. We can start out by explaining the technology that we're using. And as an example, you know, in the past, people tried to prove that they had logs that showed that password failures had been documented. Today, that's not the way we provide integrity and authenticity of our records. And CSA gives us an indication that we can explain the technology we're using, and that is a much better way of showing that our records are protected than by doing scripted testing.
Thank you, Joanne. You actually answered one of the questions that some Part 11 requirements are no longer applicable. It's irrelevant with the current advanced technology. Thank you for that. See, you already answered it. All right. I guess this question is, you know, hopefully a short one. Is there anything cooking here? Regulations have not changed. Is the agency expecting an update?
So I think the agency's been expecting an update for 20 years, right? That's why they put the regional policy out there. You know, it's something that's been so embedded in a lot of the systems and processes. It just takes time, and it is a broad agency activity to tackle Part 11, right? So this is not going to be a quick, easy one to weave out of. Is the agency aware of the need to do something with Part 11? Absolutely. You know, are they, you know, trying to figure out what the best strategy is for that? Yes. Where is that in the process and how long it's going to take? That's something that we have no clarity on.
Thank you. Gentlemen and ladies and gentlemen, what I'm going to ask you, I know you're seeing the chat. What I'd like you to do, since we have a lot of questions, so if you can start from the top, there's some questions. If you want to pick the one that you feel comfortable with, and I see Daniel is ready. If you see any of the questions and you want to go ahead and answer it, I'd rather do that if you can just read the question and answer it yourself. So that way you're comfortable with it. And whoever is ready, you can go on.
Yeah, why don't there's a couple here that link, I think, together in some way, shape, or form. The one's talking about, you know, and here's the question: we talk about being able to rely on a software vendor's processes and documentation to reduce the effort on the client side. However, if vendors use unscripted ad hoc testing with less documentation evidence, how can a client walk away with what the vendor really did and how thorough and successful their testing really was? You know, to me, I see also some with the question that says CSA seems to be rolling out the red carpet for using Agile Scrum or GXP. Do you agree? And the one that says, will the role of, especially in SaaS vendors, CSA be addressed? Does a good vendor support application validation responsibility, simply inform risk or other? So let's just block those out in a couple, but the first one to quickly address is the idea that CSA is rolling out the red carpet for Agile Scrum. I actually think the general principles of validation already did that ages ago. The idea of Agile and Scrum was accepted. The principles were there. All we were saying here with this is, yes, we agree. They apply. They might apply even better for some of these cases where you're talking about SaaS and you've got to be a little bit faster and more adept at keeping pace with the changes. So when you're talking about relying on the vendor's processes, just because they are using unscripted testing or you know, ad hoc testing throughout their life cycle or the process, same thing would be for you as the manufacturer, doesn't mean that there isn't a set of objective evidence generated, right? Every agile process, even at the end of a 2-week cycle, if there's nothing else, there is still a proof period. There is a demo of the system. It shows what works, what doesn't work, and what the next iteration is. That's all captured and documented. So there is evidence in an objective record of the work that's being done. The question then being, you know, when you talk about that confidence that you'd like to have with your vendor is, what does it take for you as an organization to say you're confident in that activity? Do you need to see every element of that process for that software being developed? Do you need to have a foundational understanding of their software development lifecycle, and is that sufficient? Is it sufficient just to see the operating and system working right, as intended at the end? That's you know, how you set up the idea of being comfortable with the vendor, right? And that's entirely up to you as an organization and your risk tolerance, right? And a good vendor is open to working with you with that, around that, right? Now, it doesn't mean that you're going to get that same level of care from every vendor out there, right? You got a big vendor, they service a lot of industries. You may not get that level of care from them. Doesn't mean that their product is not good, right? Or worth utilizing. It just means now, okay, you're going to have to then make sure that you're basing your confidence on some things that you're comfortable with when you make that story and present that story forward.
I'm
Awesome.
going to I want to draw a couple of boundaries just to add on to what Cisco is saying. And it does, and most of us know that ultimately the company is responsible for the issues that they face. You're not going to be able to foist it off on a vendor. You made the decision to use that vendor. Now in devices, that's our 82050, that's our purchasing control regulation that controls our supplier agreements. Supplier agreements is nothing more than a documented set of risk management for how you use to choose to use your vendors and to the levels of scaling for what you consider for a vendor in that case. If you do trust a vendor, great. That should be much like I've been saying pretty commonly so far. That's a risk-based decision that has a traceable outcome as to why you made the decision to take the actions or not take the actions that you did. So say the vendor chooses to abdicate their things, it still falls on the company as to whether or not what the vendor has done is acceptable. If that's not acceptable, there's two paths there. One, you have to make it acceptable for your own self, your own written risk. And two, how you deal with the vendor, that's your own business. But that still needs to be met for the purpose, again, what's the outcome? Patience. Whatever you have coming out through this system needs to be understandable, integral, and explainable, so that when, as you are, you have the concern of FDA walking in, you shouldn't have to have that, oh, well, we fought with ABC vendor, and that means that we can't, do this or that. No, that still falls back on you. So how do you get to that point? Does that mean, again, you put a little bit more energy into that supplier agreement that vendor comes in and say, I want this kind of testing. They don't want to give it to you? Well, there's a glaring risk in front of you now. Do you move forward and accept it? Or do you consider another vendor? That's the kind of stuff that these risk documents and that risk framework go about. So just to add into that, the idea.
Thank you. Joanne, it looks like, have you found your question?
Yeah, so just one little part of that is that the Part 11 requirements are pretty easy from one organization to another. If you're using a software vendor who's commonly used in industry and it's found that their controls are in place, I don't need to see detailed scripting from them. I need them to say it was designed for this, it was tested for this. And as Cisco said, I can tell. I mean, I look and there's either an audit trail or there's not. The signature has all the components or it doesn't. It's very easy for me to know that their software meets those requirements. And if they've tested it, why would I repeat that test?
Absolutely. Yep. Awesome. Any other questions that you picked?
I got to read through a little bit.
Yeah, I see one, there's one here talking about risk decisions not being agreed to by the agency. Again, that's an elephant in the room, all right? We're gonna have investigators that come in, sit across the table from you, they put the document down and say, this is here. Why wouldn't the agency accept a risk decision? And I'm not saying that, I'm saying that as a hypothetical. I might throw out a couple of things here and ask my panelists also to consider, weighing in on it. But off the top of my head, there's something that just doesn't concretely make sense. If you're putting a risk decision down where it's evident that, and I'm going to use an absurd answer as something here. Say you have a final acceptance test where you have a criteria, but you have a lot of flexibility in justifying or overlaying or allowing deviant responses to get through. that might call into question the risk assessment that was there to begin with. And the investigator might ask about that. The reason they might ask is because those products end up going out to patients. So this is just walking that, and that is a critical 2-3 step assessment as to why. So I would exact that same kind of thing. If it's a 5 why or whatever decision making for drilling down onto how you came to the decisions you came to for your risk levels, if the agency is standing forward to that, why? Why would you see that? Does it seem like it's too light, which is the patient's risk that the agency is defending? Would it seem that it's too heavy, which would be the manufacturer's risk that you would be defending? The difference between those two and the happy medium and being able to describe that, that's where the critical thinking needs to come in. And again, we recognize that there is not a perfect system. But in the end, we seek to look out for the welfare of patients, and most companies' vision statements in this field, they do too. So I think it should be a very easy common ground to meet somewhere on and say this matters or this doesn't matter. And if it doesn't matter, the explanation should be very straightforward.
There was one question here that I'm going to answer a yes or no. Is Cisco aware if Annex 11 is being updated? Yes, he is aware. That's an easy one on your behalf, Cisco. As a matter of fact, I'm not sure who's from the FDA is on the panel leading the effort for the concept paper to be revised. Okay. Should I pick a question for you? There was one about AI here.
I see one about UAT that I could give my opinion on. It's for systems that are developed and used by the same company, where do you draw the line between software development testing and UAT validation testing? So for our organization, the group that's developing the software does the testing to show that the software functions to the requirements. But the user acceptance testing, validation testing, has to be done by the group that is going to use the software, not the people who developed it. So the developers can never tell the users the software works. The users have to tell the developers that it works. So for me, UAT has to be executing the software in the environment it's intended and making sure that you can accomplish what you needed to do with the software.
All right, this is, I'm gonna ask that question actually. I kind of like it. How does CSA impact qualification activities for GAM5, CAT5 equipment used for medical device fabrication? So again, this is not software as a medical device. It's not enterprise software, but it's sounds like software for equipment.
So I think that's always been in the intended scope, right? When we talk about what we're covering, it's the, within 827DI, it's, software used as part of production or quality systems, right? If you're automating in that space, you're still relying on the software, right? We didn't speak to the actual process validation pieces. That's somewhere else. What we talked to about here was, okay, within that space, if you're validating the software in that process, here's an approach that you can factor in. And if it's part of the whole process validation anyways, you might be able to leverage pieces of all that in terms of making your case for the work that you do, right, from an assurance standpoint. So it, again, should be universally applicable there. It's not a either or, but it's, if there's anything specific or concerns around that people are seeing or highlighting, it'd be great to get some feedback on that.
Awesome.
There's a question here in the chat that I want to lob this up for the panel because I think this one's a great one. It's simple too.
Go ahead.
What do you say to manufacturers who are perhaps too risk averse?
I would argue again, I'd say 100%. If the risk is compliance, and this comes to I think the other question that came out with fear there. You know, are you then doing things for the right reasons? You guys have mentioned it multiple times beforehand. There's a question of disagreement with regards to, is your risk assessment appropriate, right? But if you've documented it and you've got the data to say it, whether we agree or disagree as an auditor or investigator, that's a question for debate or discussion, right? It's not going to lead to a shutdown of your site or your firm, as long as there's that, you know, reasonable justification. Then you can prove it's actually effective. Now, what I think we are trying to make sure that people understand is we're not there to talk about risk of a system in particular. That's not FDA's bucket, right? We're not the technology regulator. We care about the impact of that if it doesn't work as intended on the product or downstream communications. So if that's the focus of your risk discussion, there really isn't a lot more wiggle room or area for us to argue or play in if you can make the argument from that standpoint. So I think that's part of what we've been trying to highlight or state within the guidance is this is where the focus is. Let's put it back here. Let's not talk about the system. Let's talk about this. Even the Part 11 piece, right? It is a data integrity discussion. Are you sure that you're maintaining the integrity of the information of the record itself within the system, whoever is accessing and using the system, right? If you're doing that, you know, very, very unlikely that you're going to have an impact stream to a patient or product issue.
And I agree with that. And, you know, one of the questions I ask teams, if they are doing hundreds and hundreds of test scripts and generally executing those test scripts over and over and over again, and they've never had a failure, you're spending a tremendous amount of time doing something that is not in any way identifying risks, reducing risks, making your system more compliant, more robust, anything. You're just spending time and creating documents that nobody is ever going to use in any beneficial way. And there's nothing in the intent of the regulation that says waste time. It says make your system strong. And so focus on that.
Awesome.
I'm gonna throw one last thing on top of that. Risk aversion from within a company often depends on how high up the risk aversion is. And I'm just going to be blunt here. Sometimes that's the company's chief legal counsel. Sometimes it's director of whatever. And it's somebody who's been either burned in their past or is getting paid to be aware of being burned. Okay, let's just lay that on the table, because there's going to be some people whose role it is to provide that point of view. Now, that doesn't mean that that becomes law, and it doesn't mean that it becomes operating practice. It should be part of a healthy discussion, certainly. And I'm not going to sit here and say that it's right or wrong. You know, it's hard to know every particular company's regulatory history. If there was somebody in a company's previous past that caused a burning at that company that then in turn causes a massive, you know, a flinching of the sorts. There are so many scenarios under which that could occur. It's not possible to speak to it with a simple phrase. But we're sitting here saying the idea that you can spell it out, explain it, follow it, do it, and it should be clear to any just regular outside person to ask a question about it will help.
And one more piece to that. There are things we do to our systems that introduce risk. Test those, evaluate those. Not all changes are the same. Not all changes should be handled the same way. So don't, you know, but spend the time doing that analysis and figuring out where the real risk is and address those.
There is one question here. I think I'm going to ask it anyway. How critical is it to address all the items in the Part 11 checklist? And I think we discussed that Part 11 requirements. It's nothing but business requirement, right? So I'll let you guys comment on that.
I think that's correct. If you put them out as a checklist like that for making sure that you're addressing them, chances are you're going to get into a scenario where you're probably over applying them versus just thinking about them in the business requirement standpoint, right? And I think that's part of the discussion. I mean, just quickly, there's a great question here that says, so I definitely agree the industry's gone overboard in terms of effort and documentation to show compliance with Part 11 and computer validation in general. Is this the result of inspectors asking for volumes of evidence for each detail? I'm going to say that it's not about the investigator asking for volumes, but it could be about the investigator about asking for that identification of validation, that proof in a more general way, and getting volumes of information, right, that they've got to then sift and filter through. There's a bit of ownership on both sides in that process. Does the industry need to push back more during inspections? I'm going to say that instead of pushing back, if you actually start from the framing of that risk discussion, you'll find that the investigator is going to be all 100% on board right from the very beginning.
Awesome. I know we reached the 11 o'clock mark here, and I'm sure you've got other things to get to. Thank you so much. I know there was a bunch of other questions. We're going to kind of put them together. I'm not going to promise we're going to respond to all of them, but we'll try our best. Joanne, Cisco, Daniel, thank you so much. To our attendees, we will share with you the slide deck. There is some really useful link here for you. Oops, if I go there, to really look at, and for that person who asked about Annex 11 revision, yes, it is there, so you can track the status of where it is. And also, there is, back in 2022, we did a whole series of webinars with Joanne, with Cisco, with Daniel. Please take a look, attend, learn more about CSA and how to apply it. And that's it, really. Thank you so much. Thanks for everyone. Thank you, John Kirchner and the Connects team. I hope everyone got what they wanted.
Thanks again. Let me add my thanks and hope everybody has a great day, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Thank you again, Khalid, Cisco, Daniel, and Joanne. Thanks. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.